March 17, 1941. Somewhere in the English Midlands. The lorry rattled down muddy lanes beneath skies the color of wet slate, carrying men who expected to die. Hauptmann Klaus Müller sat rigid in the canvas-covered bed, hands bound, eyes fixed on nothing. Around him, 19 other Luftwaffe pilots swayed with the vehicle's motion, silent, pale, wearing the peculiar dignity of the condemned. They had been briefed extensively on what awaited them. The Reich's intelligence services had been unambiguous. British captivity meant interrogation chambers, starvation rations, systematic humiliation designed to break the Aryan spirit. Müller had committed these warnings to memory alongside his oath of silence. He would reveal nothing. He would endure. He would maintain honor until the inevitable end. Through the gap in the canvas he glimpsed green fields, stone walls, a countryside impossibly serene for a nation supposedly on the brink of collapse. The lorry slowed. Gravel crunched beneath wheels. Then came voices, English voices, calm, almost bored, and the canvas pulled back to reveal not executioners but middle-aged soldiers with clipboards, standing before wooden barracks that looked more like a rural boarding school than a death camp. Müller's certainty wavered for the first time since his Me-109 had plunged smoking into the channel. The camp at Grisdale Hall sprawled across what had once been a country estate in the Lake District, requisitioned, repurposed, surrounded by barbed wire that seemed almost decorative against the backdrop of English pastoral beauty. The processing took 3 hours. Each prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, issued a Red Cross registration number, and assigned to a barracks. No one struck them. No one shouted. A British sergeant with a magnificent mustache explained in serviceable German the camp regulations. Roll call twice daily, male privileges subject to censorship, Red Cross parcels distributed weekly, Geneva Convention protections observed without exception. Müller listened with the attention of a man awaiting the punchline to an elaborate joke. This was theater, obviously, a psychological tactic to lower defenses before the real interrogation began. The barracks were heated, not luxuriously but adequately. Wooden bunks with straw mattresses, thin but present blankets, a stove that actually functioned. Oberleutnant Hans Weber, shot down 3 weeks earlier over Dover, occupied the bunk beside Müller's. "It's all part of the technique," Weber whispered that first night, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had solved the puzzle. "They make you comfortable, make you grateful, then exploit that gratitude. The interrogators will come soon, then we'll see the truth." The others nodded in the darkness, finding comfort in this explanation. It made sense. It fit the narrative they had been trained to expect. But the interrogators didn't come. Not that night, nor the next, nor the week after. Instead came a Red Cross representative, Swiss neutral officious, who inspected the facilities with bureaucratic thoroughness, interviewed prisoners privately, and filed reports that apparently mattered to someone. Instead came parcels, chocolate, cigarettes, tinned meat, playing cards, books in German. Instead came a British camp commandant, a colonel with a kindly face and impeccable manners, who gave a speech about maintaining civilized standards even in wartime, and seemed genuinely to mean it. Müller watched all this with growing confusion that bordered on paranoia. Where was the torture? Where was the starvation? Where was the ideological assault they had been promised? He began to suspect something far more insidious, that the British were so confident of victory, so secure in their moral superiority, that they could afford to treat their enemies well. It was, he thought, the ultimate expression of contempt, kindness as condescension. The first football match happened by accident. Or perhaps it was inevitable. Young men confined, energetic, bored, and the British had left sports equipment in a storage shed as if the possibility of prisoners wanting recreation had been anticipated in some manual. Lieutenant Friedrich Koch, a former university athlete from München, found the leather ball and brought it to the muddy field behind the barracks with the excitement of a child. Within minutes, 20 men were kicking it around, organizing themselves into improvised teams, shouting and laughing with an enthusiasm that felt almost treasonous. Müller watched from the barracks window, disturbed by the scene. This was exactly what the enemy wanted. Complacency, contentment, the slow erosion of vigilance. That evening, Weber approached him with news delivered in hushed tones. The British commandant had not only permitted the football game, but had offered to provide proper goals, referee whistles, and permission to form an organized league if the prisoners wished. "You see?" Weber said, his paranoia finding new fuel. "They're trying to make us forget we're at war. They want us soft, domesticated, grateful. It's brilliant, really. A prison that doesn't feel like a prison, so we don't think like prisoners." Miller agreed, but even as he nodded, a small voice in the back of his mind asked an uncomfortable question. If this was psychological warfare, why did it feel less like manipulation and more like normalcy? The other prisoners divided into camps. Some, like Weber, interpreted every British kindness as strategic deception. Others, mostly the younger pilots, those who had seen less combat, began to relax into the routine with dangerous enthusiasm. They organized the football league. They formed study groups to learn English. They wrote letters home that passed through censors who occasionally corrected their grammar, but never seemed to extract intelligence. And slowly, incrementally, the mythology they had arrived with began to crack. Britain was not starving. The guards ate the same rations they did, and while plain the food was adequate, sometimes better. Britain was not in chaos. The infrastructure visible from the camp worked with boring efficiency. Britain was not a dying empire gasping its last. It was a functioning society that had absorbed the shock of war and adapted with stubborn, infuriating competence. Mueller felt the ground shifting beneath his understanding of the world. June 1941. The first reversal. The news reached them through contraband radios, assembled piece by prisoners who were, after all, trained in aviation technology and electrical systems. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union. The announcement triggered jubilation among the prisoners. This was it, the decisive campaign, the war-winning stroke that would crush Bolshevism and force Britain to negotiate. Miller joined the celebrations, but with reservation. The numbers bothered him. 3 million men committed to a front spanning thousands of kilometers, supply lines stretching across territories where roads dissolved into mud for half the year, an enemy with population reserves that dwarfed the Reich's. He had studied logistics as part of his officer training, had learned how wars were won not just by courage, but by production capacity, by the ability to feed and equip armies across vast distances. The British guards said nothing, but Miller noticed their expressions. Not worry exactly, something closer to grim satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for Germany to make precisely this mistake. One guard, a corporal named Davies who had fought in the Great War, stopped by Miller's barracks one evening, ostensibly to check the stove. "Big show that," he remarked, nodding toward the celebration still ongoing outside. "Your lads seem confident." Miller bristled at the familiarity but answered, "We will be in Moscow by autumn." Davies smiled, not mockingly but with the patience of someone who had heard such predictions before. "Russia's a big place," he said mildly, "bigger than maps make it look, and winter comes early there." It was a small interaction, easily dismissed, but it stayed with Mueller because of what happened 3 days later. A football match, Germans versus a team of British guards who had challenged them to friendly competition. The prisoners won, 4-2, and expected something, resentment perhaps, or disciplinary response. Instead, the British congratulated them with genuine good humor, and the commandant presented a small trophy, a carved wooden cup with the date inscribed. "Well played," he said in careful German. "Same time next week?" Miller accepted the trophy, feeling its weight in his hands, and realized with creeping unease that he was being treated not as a dangerous enemy to be contained, but as a worthy opponent to be respected. The distinction mattered. It implied equality. It implied that Britain did not fear them. The psychological effects manifested subtly at first. Feldwebel Ernst Schneider, a decorated bomber pilot, began refusing to participate in escape planning committees, not from cowardice, but from a growing conviction that escape was pointless. "Look around," he told Weber during one heated argument. "They feed us. They don't beat us. The Red Cross visits regularly. Our families receive letters. What exactly are we escaping to? Cities being bombed? Rationing the Eastern Front?" Weber called him defeatist, possibly treasonous, but Schneider's words echoed because others had been thinking them. Miller noticed the changes in himself as well. He had stopped checking the perimeter for weaknesses. He had started attending the English language classes, telling himself it was for intelligence gathering, knowing that excuse grew thinner by the day. He had accepted a position managing the camp library, organizing books donated by the Red Cross and local British civilians who apparently believed that even enemy prisoners deserved literature. The library contained everything: German classics, English novels, technical manuals, philosophical texts. No censorship beyond removing current military information. Müller spent hours there, reading accounts of the previous war, memoirs by British officers who wrote about German soldiers with respect, even admiration. One book, All Quiet on the Western Front, by Remarque, hit him particularly hard. It had been banned in Germany as defeatist propaganda. Reading it now, in this strange limbo of captivity, he understood why. It told truths about war that ideology couldn't survive. The camp began to develop its own culture, a hybrid thing, neither fully German nor British, but something new. The football league expanded. Theater performances were organized, with prisoners building sets and sewing costumes with a professionalism that would have impressed peacetime audiences. A prisoner who had been an economist before the war started teaching classes on international trade. Another, a former engineer, gave lectures on aviation technology that the British allowed because the information was already obsolete. And always, underneath everything, the question that no one wanted to voice: if the British could organize this, could maintain this level of civilization and administrative competence while simultaneously fighting a global war, what did that say about German assumptions of British weakness? What did it say about the propaganda that had promised them an empire in terminal decline, ready to collapse at the first serious push? Müller began writing a journal. He didn't know why. Maybe to preserve sanity. Maybe to document the transformation he felt happening inside himself. Autumn, 1941. The intelligence subplot emerges. Captain James Thornton had been watching the prisoners with the trained eye of someone whose job was more complex than it appeared. Officially, he was the camp's education officer, responsible for organizing recreational activities and maintaining morale. Unofficially, he was MI9, military intelligence focused on prisoners of war, escape prevention, and information extraction, but not through torture. The British had learned through trial and extensive error during the Great War that torture produced unreliable intelligence and violated the conventions that protected their own captured men. Better methods existed, subtler methods. Thornton had noticed Hauptmann Müller within the first week, the way he observed everything, the intelligence evident in his questions, the gradual softening of his ideological certainty, classic indicators of someone undergoing cognitive dissonance, someone whose lived experience was contradicting his received beliefs. These were the prisoners who sometimes provided the most valuable intelligence, not through interrogation, but through conversation. Casual conversations in the library, discussions about literature or history or aviation engineering, talk that revealed not military secrets but something more useful: how the German military actually functioned, how orders flowed, how morale was maintained, what pilots were being told about the war's progress. Thornton began frequenting the library. Never pushy, never obviously interrogating. Just another book lover, happy to discuss Thomas Mann or Goethe or the technical specifications of radial versus inline aircraft engines. Müller, starved for intellectual conversation, responded. They talked about the Messerschmitt's fuel efficiency problems, about the challenges of maintaining air superiority over increasingly well-defended British airspace, about the logistical nightmares of supporting air operations across multiple fronts. To Müller, these were abstract technical discussions. To Thornton, they were puzzle pieces that, combined with information from other prisoners in other camps, built a comprehensive picture of the Luftwaffe's actual capabilities versus its propaganda image. But something unexpected happened. Thornton began to like Müller, to respect him. The man was intelligent, thoughtful, grappling honestly with difficult questions. He reminded Thornton of German officers he had met before the war, at international aviation conferences, men who loved flying more than ideology. This was the problem with treating prisoners humanely. They stopped being abstractions and became individuals. Individuals you might, in another life, have called friends. Thornton filed his intelligence reports with growing ambivalence, wondering if this method of warfare, this slow erosion of enemy certainty through demonstrated decency, was brilliant or dangerous. Perhaps both. December 1941. The weight of impossible decisions. The news from the Eastern Front arrived in fragments. Official German communiques claiming glorious victories. British newspapers, which prisoners weren't supposed to see but somehow did, reporting stalled advances and horrific casualties, and letters from home that passed through censors and arrived months late, carrying between their lines the fear that no propaganda could mask. Müller's sister wrote from Berlin, "We pray for you nightly. The war will surely end soon." The forced optimism told him everything. Germany was not winning, not quickly at least, and winter had come to Russia, exactly as Corporal Davies had predicted. Then came Pearl Harbor. The Americans were in the war now, not as distant suppliers but as active combatants. The mathematics shifted again. Müller lay awake, calculating production capacities, American industrial output, British manufacturing stubbornly functional despite the bombing, Soviet factories relocated beyond the Urals and churning out T-34s by the thousands. Against this, Germany's overstretched supply lines, oil shortages, the attrition of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The numbers didn't favor the Reich. They never had, he realized. The entire strategy had depended on quick victories before enemy production could mobilize. That window had closed. Oberleutnant Weber organized an escape attempt. 15 men, a tunnel, 3 months of careful work. They asked Müller to join. He refused. "Why?" Weber demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. "Because I'm comfortable here? Because the British have domesticated me?" Müller met his eyes. "Because the tunnel leads nowhere useful," he said quietly. "Because even if we reach Germany, what then? We're pilots without aircraft, officers in an army that's losing. Because..." He stopped, unable to finish the thought. "Because I'm no longer certain which side I should be fighting for." The escape failed. The British discovered the tunnel, through informants, rumor said, though Müller suspected the guards had known all along and simply waited to see who would be foolish enough to try. The 15 men were punished with 2 weeks in isolation. No library privileges, no football, no Red Cross parcels, no violence, no torture, just boredom and disappointment. After their release, Weber looked at Müller with something like hatred. "You were right," he said, the words bitter as ash. "But that doesn't mean you're not a coward." Müller accepted the judgment. He had stopped knowing which labels applied to him anymore. Loyal soldier? Prisoner of war? Traitor? Realist? The categories that had once been clear now blurred together into moral gray. Spring 1942. The escalation of understanding. The camp population swelled. New prisoners arrived weekly. Crews from downed bombers. Fighter pilots shot down over France, survivors from naval engagements. Each batch brought fresh certainty about German invincibility, and Müller watched with fascination as that certainty eroded, usually within 6 weeks. The pattern repeated. Initial defiance, suspicion of British softness, gradual realization that the food was adequate and the treatment fair, cognitive dissonance, and finally, reluctant acceptance. Some never completed the journey, clinging to ideology with desperate intensity, but most eventually relaxed into the strange reality of being prisoners who were not tortured, enemies who were not hated, human beings treated as such even in the midst of total war. The Football League had become elaborate. 6 teams, a proper tournament structure, referees, both British and German, painted goalposts, even modest spectator stands built by prisoners with carpentry skills. British guards participated, sometimes playing against the Germans, sometimes alongside them in mixed teams. The matches grew competitive, but remained friendly, mostly. When tempers flared, it was the German prisoners themselves who often intervened, having unconsciously absorbed British notions of fair play. Müller, who had taken up refereeing, found himself enforcing rules with an impartiality that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Sport as diplomacy, sport as sanity, sport as acknowledgement that they were young men trapped by circumstances beyond their control, finding what humanity they could in shared rituals. New intelligence reached them. The RAF was bombing German cities now systematically in retaliation for the Blitz. Hamburg, Cologne, the Ruhr industrial centers. Müller thought of his family, hoped they were safe, and felt a complicated grief that had no clear target. Who was responsible? Hitler, for starting the war. Churchill, for refusing peace terms. The pilots, British and German, who followed orders. Himself, for having believed the propaganda that promised glory without consequences. The clarity he had once possessed, the certainty about right and wrong, us and them, victory and defeat, had shattered into fragments that wouldn't reassemble into any coherent pattern. Captain Thornton noticed the change. In their library conversations, Müller had stopped defending German strategy and started analyzing it with clinical detachment. "We're losing, aren't we?" he said one day, not as a question but as a statement seeking confirmation. Thornton considered his response carefully. "The war isn't over," he said finally, "but the outcome grows clearer." Müller nodded. He had known, had perhaps always known, underneath the propaganda and the hope. Now he simply admitted it. Summer 1943. Convergence of secrets and unlikely alliances. The impossible happened. German prisoners began volunteering information, not under coercion, but from conviction. A U-boat engineer, haunted by guilt, drew detailed diagrams of submarine systems and explained their vulnerabilities. A logistics officer provided data on supply chain weaknesses in the Atlantic Wall. A former Nazi Party member recanted his ideology in a written statement that he insisted be forwarded to German resistance groups, if such groups existed. The British handled these offerings delicately, verifying information, protecting sources, never pressuring those who chose silence. But the dam had cracked. Men who had arrived expecting torture were instead treated with dignity, and some responded by betraying the regime that had lied to them. Others called them traitors. Müller avoided judgment. He understood both sides too well. He had become something unexpected, a bridge. When new prisoners arrived angry and defiant, it was often Müller who spoke to them, who explained the reality of their situation, who translated not just language but context. "The British aren't weak," he told a young pilot from Dresden who still spouted propaganda. "They're different. Their strength is in systems, in institutions that function regardless of individual leadership. They don't need a Führer because the entire society is mobilized. Do you understand? We're not losing to an inferior people. We're losing to a competent democracy." The words would have been treasonous in Germany. Here, they were simply true. Captain Thornton watched this transformation with professional satisfaction and personal unease. Müller had become, without official designation, an asset, someone whose influence on other prisoners served British interests. But he was also becoming a friend, and Thornton struggled with the ethics of that relationship. Was he exploiting Müller's crisis of faith, or simply allowing a decent man to reach his own conclusions? The distinction mattered, though Thornton couldn't articulate exactly why. They played chess in the library, discussions of strategy blending seamlessly with discussions of the war. "What happens after?" Müller asked one evening, moving his knight into position. "After Germany surrenders, what happens to us?" Thornton captured a pawn, considering. "That depends. On the peace terms, on what kind of Germany emerges, on whether individuals can be separated from the regime they served." He looked up. "On whether redemption is possible." Müller met his eyes. "Is it?" Thornton smiled sadly. "I hope so. For all our sakes." Checkmate came 3 moves later, though neither man was certain which game they had actually been playing. Winter, 1944. Preparation for the inevitable end. The Allied invasion of Normandy changed everything and nothing. In the camp, routines continued. Football matches, English classes, library discussions. But underneath ran a current of anticipation, mixed with dread. Germany was losing, obviously now, undeniably. The question was no longer if but when and how. What would defeat look like? What would happen to prisoners? What would happen to Germany itself? Some prisoners clung to fantasies of miracle weapons, of sudden reversal. Others sank into depression. Müller existed in a strange state of clarity. He had accepted the loss, mourned it, and moved beyond it into territory he couldn't yet name. New arrivals brought stories of a Germany transforming under total war, cities in rubble, civilian casualties mounting, the draft reaching into categories previously exempt, teenage boys and old men pressed into service, rations reduced to starvation levels. The contrast with their own situation grew more surreal. Prisoners in British camps ate better than civilians in the Reich. They were safer, warmer, treated more humanely than their own government now treated its citizens. The propaganda had inverted. Britain was the civilized power, Germany, the barbarous one. Müller watched younger prisoners grapple with this reversal, saw in their faces the same confusion he had felt 3 years earlier. Time had become circular, each new group repeating the psychological journey from certainty through doubt to reluctant understanding. Plans formed. The British were preparing for post-war disposition of prisoners, evaluating who could be safely repatriated, who might need further observation, who might face war crimes tribunals. Müller and others like him, those who had never been SS, who had served in the military rather than party organizations, who had demonstrated cooperative behavior, were being categorized as low risk. "You'll likely be among the first sent home," Captain Thornton told him, "when Germany can properly receive you." Müller nodded, feeling neither relief nor joy. Home meant ruins. Home meant a defeated nation, an ideology discredited, a future utterly uncertain. He had survived the war physically but had lost something less tangible, the beliefs that had structured his understanding of the world. What did you become when everything you had been taught turned out to be false? The Football League held its final championship match in December. German team versus British Guards, freezing rain turning the pitch to mud, both sides playing with fierce determination for a wooden trophy that meant nothing and everything. The Germans won, 3-2. They shook hands afterward. Opponents who had become colleagues, enemies who had become impossibly something like friends. April 1945. The direct confrontation with reality. Berlin fell. Hitler was dead. The photographs arrived, smuggled, officially restricted but circulating anyway, of the concentration camps. Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. Images that defied comprehension. Skeletal figures behind wire. Mass graves. Industrial facilities designed for systematic murder. The British showed them deliberately, methodically to every prisoner who would look. Some refused. Oberleutnant Weber called them propaganda, forgeries, exaggerations, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from survivors, confessions from guards, documents in German with official stamps and signatures. This had been done, in their name, by their countrymen, under the flag they had served. Müller stared at the photographs for hours. He thought of the speeches he had heard about racial purity, the casual anti-Semitism that had permeated the officer corps, the rumors he had ignored about special actions in the East, because they seemed too monstrous to be true. He had told himself he was just a pilot, just following orders, uninvolved in political matters. But his bombs had fallen on cities. His skills had served the regime that built those camps. There was no clean separation between military honor and moral horror. He wept, not dramatically, but with the quiet devastation of someone whose entire self-conception had collapsed. The confrontation with Weber happened in the barracks. "How can you believe them?" Weber shouted, holding up British newspapers. "This is enemy propaganda designed to make us hate ourselves." Müller turned slowly. "Look at the photos," he said, his voice flat. "Look at the German documents. Look at the faces of the survivors. This happened. We served the people who did this." Weber's face twisted with rage and desperation. "We were soldiers. We fought honorably. We're not responsible for—" "We wore the uniform," Müller interrupted. "We lent our skill and courage to a regime that built factories of death. That makes us responsible. Not for building them, perhaps, but for enabling them, for not asking questions, for believing the lies were true and the truths were lies." The silence in the barracks was absolute. 20 men, each grappling with the same terrible knowledge. Some would never accept it. Some would rationalize, minimize, retreat into denial. But others, a significant portion, felt the weight of collective guilt settling onto shoulders that had been trained to carry responsibility. This was the ultimate defeat, not military, but moral. They had not just lost a war. They had fought for evil. Summer 1945. The apex of war and transformation. Repatriation began in stages. The British were systematic. Former Wehrmacht personnel with clean records returned first to assist with reconstruction. SS members and suspected war criminals remained detained for tribunal investigation. Müller was classified for early return. He received his papers in July, a ticket home to a country that no longer existed in any form he recognized. Germany was divided, occupied, its cities rubble, its population traumatized and starving. He would be going back to help rebuild. But rebuild what? And on what foundation? The final football match was impromptu. A pickup game on a summer evening. Germans and British mixed together. No teams, no score kept. Just men playing because they enjoyed it. Müller watched from the sideline. Too old suddenly. Too tired. Captain Thornton sat beside him. They had said little since the photographs. Both men caught in their own processing of horror. "What will you do?" Thornton asked finally. "When you're home," Müller considered. "Whatever I can. Help rebuild, I suppose. Try to make something better from the ruins." He paused. And you? Similar, Thornton said. Britain won, but winning isn't the same as being undamaged. We're broke, exhausted, changed. The empire's ending. Everything's ending. They sat in companionable silence, watching young men chase a ball across grass. Thank you, Miller said quietly. Thornton looked at him surprised. For what? For treating us like human beings. For not torturing us. For the football and the books and the dignity, he struggled with the words. For showing us that the enemy we had been taught to despise was more humane than the regime we served. I needed to learn that. We all did. It's a terrible lesson, but necessary. Thornton nodded slowly. It was policy, he said. Geneva Convention. But also, he stopped, searching for honesty. Also because we wanted you to see, to understand, that democracy isn't weakness. That treating people decently isn't naive. That there are better ways to organize society than what you had. He smiled sadly. I hope you remember, when you're rebuilding. Miller left the next morning. He shook hands with British guards he had once expected would execute him. He embraced German prisoners who were staying longer. He took one last look at the football pitch, the library, the barracks that had been prison and sanctuary and university all at once. Then he boarded the lorry, the same type that had brought him 4 years earlier, and headed toward an uncertain future, carrying with him the knowledge that even enemies could teach you truth. The lorry stopped at a Dover dock, where a military transport waited. Hundreds of German prisoners milled about, carrying small bundles of possessions, mostly books, letters, things that had sustained them through captivity. Mueller stood at the rail as England receded, watching the white cliffs fade into mist, and felt the full weight of revelation settle into permanence. This was the moment when ideology finally, irrevocably collapsed before material and moral reality. He had come to England expecting barbarism and encountered civilization. He had expected weakness and found disciplined strength. He had expected hatred and received something far more devastating, pity mixed with hope that he might become better than he had been. The other prisoners talked quietly, nervously, about what awaited them. They had heard stories: starvation in the Russian zone, summary executions of SS officers, cities where no building stood higher than rubble. But they were going anyway, because it was home, because duty called even when duty meant rebuilding rather than destroying. Miller thought about the football league, about Captain Thornton's chess moves, about the library where enemy and captive had discussed philosophy as equals. These memories would stay with him, would shape how he approached whatever came next. You couldn't unlearn respect. You couldn't unknow that your enemies were human. The revelation was this: war changes men by changing what they believe is true. He had believed Germany was strong, invincible, morally superior. Every day in British captivity had contradicted those beliefs, not through propaganda or torture, but through the simple evidence of competent administration, fair treatment, and moral consistency. The British had defeated him, not by breaking his body, but by demonstrating that everything he had been taught was false. And the deepest irony, they had done this while adhering to rules, while maintaining civilization, while organizing football leagues for men who had bombed their cities. That was power, real power, the kind that outlasted any military victory. The transport's engines rumbled. Germany approached. Mueller gripped the rail and made himself a promise. He would remember. He would tell the truth about his captivity, about the humanity he had encountered, about the lessons learned through the strange pedagogy of decent treatment. He would help build a Germany that could organize football leagues for its enemies, that could maintain honor without needing supremacy, that could be strong enough to be kind. It seemed impossible. But 4 years ago, British humanity had also seemed impossible. Perhaps the world was more surprising than anyone's ideology allowed. Decades later, historians would examine the British POW camp system with scholarly detachment, noting its strategic brilliance. By adhering rigorously to Geneva Convention standards, Britain ensured reciprocal treatment of British prisoners held by Germany. Mostly, by treating captured Luftwaffe pilots with dignity, they undermined Nazi propaganda and facilitated post-war reconciliation. The policy was practical, effective, and remarkably humane for wartime. But the documents don't capture what it felt like to live through that transformation, to arrive expecting death, and gradually, painfully, learn to trust your enemy's decency more than your own government's ideology. Hauptmann Klaus Müller returned to Germany in July 1945. He worked for the Reconstruction Administration in Hamburg, helping coordinate housing for displaced persons. He never joined another political party. When asked about his war service, he spoke carefully, honestly about being a pilot who had believed propaganda and learned better through captivity. He attended reunions with other former POWs, where they played football badly, and talked about the strange gift of being imprisoned by decent people. Some never forgave themselves for serving the Reich. Others rationalized everything, claimed they knew nothing, remembered only military honor. Miller occupied a middle position, accepting responsibility while insisting on the possibility of redemption through actions, not words. Captain James Thornton received commendations for his intelligence work, but rarely spoke of it. The moral complexity troubled him. The friendships formed through strategic advantage. The manipulation inherent in kindness calculated to extract information. He retired after the war, taught literature at a minor university, and occasionally received letters from former prisoners who wrote to thank him or argue with his chess strategies or simply maintain connection. He answered them all, believing that the lines of communication established between former enemies mattered more than most diplomatic treaties. The football pitch at Griesdale Hall was plowed under after the war, returned to pasture, but the idea persisted that even in total war, civilization could be maintained, that enemies could be treated as human beings without surrendering strategic advantage, that sometimes the most powerful weapon was demonstrating moral superiority, not through words but through actions, organizing football leagues when the world expected torture chambers. They had arrived as conquerors and left as witnesses to what disciplined liberty could create. The lesson was simple. Power that requires cruelty isn't strength. It's admission of inadequacy. True strength maintains honor even toward enemies, because it knows the moral high ground is territory worth holding.